I'm going to read to you something that I wrote, and I think maybe it will reflect what message I want to convey that connects with why we're all here. I call this the piece called "The Convenience of Complicity in the Fields of Death." Many times in our lives, we come to some point in which our values and convictions are challenged and tested. In so doing, we hope that we have learned from our mistakes and from our experiences and the decisions we make. But more importantly, the question we ultimately need to ask of ourselves is, do we recognize our faults and accept our ultimate responsibility for those decisions which will severely affect others, especially when we have assumed that responsibility in the end, if not maybe even becoming complicit in a party in concert. Several days ago, I wrote an article in which I openly criticized the complicit relationship of Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger and the President of the United Farm Workers Union, Arturo Rodriguez, and their connection with the federal government's attack against workers in this country, and their close relationship with the illegitimate president of Mexico from the right-wing party of the PAN, Felipe Calderón, which I consider all three responsible for the support and the continued support of the economic policies of federal and state that continued the exploitation and the forced expulsion of millions of Mexican workers who arrive in this country having to cross a fence or a border through the most arid desert conditions, and where more than 5,000 men, women, and children have died to come to the American dream, to come to simply work in this country, when at the same time in Mexico the minimum wage today is 50 pesos, which is $5, less than $5 a day, which is what any Walmart in Mexico now pays those workers. This we consider to be in concert with the U.S.-Mexican government and the implementation of the North American Free Trade Agreement and the Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger and many others who have pushed these anti-immigrant worker attacks against workers, and in instituting the issues of racism and denying immigrant workers the right to be able to survive and to support their families. In our criticism of the United Farm Workers Union, we indicated their failure to invest time and money to organize and mobilize the farm worker communities and being a visible presence in those communities in the fields. By doing so, the union would begin to be a viable and visible force in the agricultural fields, putting pressure on the growers and the corporate interests. And abide by the very laws that the UFW and the California State Legislature and the governor agreed to enforce in the protection of workers, when in fact the UFW and the legislature and the governor signed a law that supposedly was supposed to protect workers as it relates to injuries in the fields, as it relates to heat and protection for those workers. Which now brings us to the most recent tragic death of a farm worker by the name, a young woman who is pregnant, by the name of Maria Isabel Vasquez Jimenez, a young woman who crossed the border, leaving her family behind in Oaxaca, to come to this country, to that dream, the American dream. She died of a heat-related fatality. Maria became the occupational victim in violation of state regulations that were heavily lobbied by the United Farm Workers Union and approved and ultimately signed by the governor into law 3 years ago. And in reading the news articles of the tragedy, many of us see the pictures of Maria's friends' painful grief and their support for the family's pain and anguish. I can remember vividly in those same pictures in my mind many years ago during the UFW strikes in the 1970s, when the killings of farm workers during the strike activity, and seeing the pictures of the black and white UFW flags in mourning now for Maria. And to me, this was a flashback to the past. The governor came to the funeral to pay his condolences at Maria's funeral and issued a statement released Wednesday afternoon saying, Maria's death should have been prevented. A very profound statement, I believe, when in fact both the United Farm Workers Union president and the governor stood there in front and looked into the eyes of the grieving family to, in essence, to wash their hands as it relates to the responsibility that lays on the governor for the lack of enforcement on the part of the governor in instituting, instead of having hired enough staff to go out and do the work necessary as it relates to the protection of workers. This law that was signed by the governor, in essence, lacked the deterrence as it relates to punishing those who violate the law. This law has no accountability as it relates to the certification of the training of those employers or contractors or supervisors. Therefore, the employers at whim decide whether they want to follow through with the law. And in this case, we believe that the industry cooperated and also was complicit in the death of this particular worker. As of this day, there have been 9 deaths so far in the last 3 months of many workers only in the areas of the agricultural fields. In other words, here we're talking about the death that was, the governor, as he stated, preventable, and in fact, the law that would have had, if it would have had strict enforcement liabilities and heavier fines and criminal prosecution, in which is not the case in the law that the UFW and the governor signed, who in reality are complicit and parties no one sees, and no one can see the complicity of these partners, and one wonders when the governor appears to pay respects and condolences and says to Maria's fiance, Florentino, why did you not do something about it? And he turns around, he says, because Governor, it was your job for you to have done more for Maria and many of the workers out in the fields. The other question is why the UFW supported the law that has serious consequences that should have been considered willful violations of law with criminal prosecutions. It's so meaningless in the protection of workers, this law, that this tragedy points to some very serious intentional flaws in the law, notwithstanding the governor's responsibility and enforcement procedures. One can almost say that both governor and the UFW and agribusiness in the state, to the tune of $35 to $40 billion industry, can and should be held responsible and complicit in the many deaths of many of the workers in this state, not only in agriculture. The other big question is, why has the UFW not questioned Schwarzenegger's lack of enforcement, and who does the UFW blame? No sooner than after the UFW and the governor appear at the funeral of Maria, he states to everybody and to the media that he will conduct an immediate investigation and that he was terribly sorry, but that at the same time he had other business to attend to, and that was the next day to fly to Mexico City to meet with the illegitimate president of Mexico, Felipe Calderon, the one responsible for the expulsion of millions of Mexicans as it relates to workers coming to this country. It is very clear that our partnering in the continuation of the export of $19.5 billion of goods to Mexico from the state of California and the governor's lack of having to deal with a budget deficit of now almost $20 billion, that one cannot find them complicit and responsible for many of the ills of what's happening to workers in this state. The complicit partnership of the UFW now who's seeking to export more guest workers or braceros to this country only leads us to believe one thing. Cesar Chavez and Ernesto Galarza many years ago fought against this type of export of labor. Why? Because it's compelling indentured servitude that only allows workers to be captured by a captured workforce by both the Mexican government and the U.S. government and handed over to the employers in order to do what has happened in this case for workers who are not protected by the law, nor given the rights to be able to bargain collectively or the right to maybe even choose a union of their choosing. What does this mean? What this means is that we need to question the policies of our state government and those individuals who promise to serve the people of the state of California. I myself worked for the Department of Industrial Relations for almost 27 years as a hearing officer for the Labor Commissioner's Office. And I can tell you one thing, working closely with the Department of the Cal-OSHA, when we were doing investigations, it was a routine fact that many of the investigations, when they came to fulfillment, at the end, the employer would win out. Whenever there was an infraction of a fine of $250,000, the department would send the message down from the governor's office to the department to reduce that fine and negotiate it out instead of $250,000 to $2,500. And the employer would walk out of that hearing happily and walking hand in hand with their attorneys, and at the same time, the farce of that family or those workers and injured workers receiving nothing but a zero at the end. It is this kind of activity and this kind of action on the part of our own government, and the fact that we are now facing this supposed, 15 billion to $16 billion deficit. The fact is that the employer corporate world in this state has not paid their fair share. Their fair share of taxes for the last 20 years has made the mere account of why we find that we have the governor telling us that in order to investigate and do the investigations out in the fields, he takes loan from all the other agencies, 60 people within a 3-week period to go out and enforce the law out in the fields, in the agricultural fields. What does this all mean? It means that we need to be able to address these issues. I feel that whenever I have to criticize someone for the lack of not fulfilling their obligation, it is our moral obligation to do so. So I commend the committee here for the work that they're doing in order to bring this to the forefront and be able to speak on the issue. I think it's extremely important. So I just want to thank the committee for allowing me to make this presentation, but our work continues, and I believe that we need to work closely with the whole question of our campaign now, with working with building solidarity with the Mexican unions, the Mexican workers who are struggling in Mexico are saying, por el derecho de no emigrar, for the right not to migrate. We refuse to go to a country where, in our own country, we have corporations that are paying a cheap wage. Last year, the teachers' union in Oaxaca went on strike for the sake of better working conditions, health programs for their families, health programs for the workers on the job. And in light of that, the Mexican government killed 23 of their teachers and their supporters, and jailed almost 1,000 of their people in jail. And there's people that were beaten up when they were arrested, and to this day there's people in jail. If those people who have said the only reason that we don't go to the United States is because we are sure that if we do that, we allow the government to continue to exploit, as Walmart and all the multinational corporations have done, who are moved into Mexico to pay a cheap wage of less than $5 a day. So because of this campaign and our relationship to building this movement, to deal with those issues is no different than the issues here, that workers in Mexico do not want to come to this country. But the North American Free Trade Agreement allowed for the dumping of massive amounts of corn for the last, since 1994, through under the auspices of the Republican Party under George Bush and Bill Clinton, the Democrat, who signed off on the North American Free Trade Agreement, devastating the Mexican economy, devastating the farming community, meaning that workers had no choice but to move from one community to another, to the border, and finally crossing. Today you have 12 million Mexicans living in this country, as they call it, illegally, and working in this, more than likely in this hotel, feeding and cleaning this hotel to survive and to send money back to those families. I hear this air conditioning going on, and I wonder, and it reminds me when I worked for the Department of Industrial Relations and the occupational, the Cal-OSHA office, and I filed a complaint for workman's comp as it relates to what I believe to be an occupational hazard in the air conditioning system in that particular office. And when I did that, I investigated within our own offices, because they're long-term offices where employees have been working there. I found 12 employees, state of California employees, that died of cancer in that building. The day that I filed my complaint and was assigned to one of my co-workers in that agency, Cal-OSHA, he called me up a week later, and he called me up and he said, Al, withdraw your complaint. OSHA's really pissed at you because you work for the state, and you're the labor commissioner, and now you're filing against your own department, and please withdraw it. They want to go after you, they're going to fire you. And I said, the hell with them. They're not going to fire my ass. I'm going to do what I got to do. And I said, Denver, his name was Denver. I said, Denver, where are you calling me from? He says, I'm home. I'm sick. He said, Denver, do not be calling me, okay? A month later, he comes back and he tells me that he's been diagnosed with cancer. 3 months later, he died. He died at the age of 58. And that increased to the number that I gave you, to one more person that died. This is in a building where the Cal-OSHA on Arden Way and the Labor Commissioner's office is at. And at least 3 of my co-workers during that time that I was in that office for 12 years died of cancer. And I can only say that I'm not a medical doctor, but there's some very serious situations where we have what's happening today with the governor. And what it is basically they're serving the needs of the employer community and the multinational corporations. That's their benefit. The price that we're paying is that workers are paying that price. When you have workers who are out in the fields or out in the construction site, or even in these buildings that I talk about, or even a place like this where we have these kinds of hazards. So anyway, I'm going to end it here, and I want to thank you for allowing me to speak here. I appreciate this, but I think the work that Steve and many of you are doing is extremely important, and I think that we need to fight back, and the only way we can fight back is what we're doing and being vocal about what we got to do, even if it means that we have to, they claim that it's an attack, but really it's criticism, because we live supposedly in a democratic society. We have democratic principles, and those principles are that we have a right to go to the street. Cesar Chavez told me one thing. He said, Al, don't ever forget one thing. Don't ever forget. Don't trust those damn politicians, okay? Go to the people, organize the people, mobilize the people, and get the people to move. And the only 2 weapons we have are 3. One is the streets, one is the strike, and one is the boycott. That's our power, and that's what you got to use. Mobilize and organize. Thank you very much.